All right, imagine this, a silent classroom with all the students in their seats quietly working independently. It's the perfect classroom scenario, right? No, 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 right? I don't think it would be a good idea for any student to spend most of the day quiet, but it is the worst idea for English learners. You have to use the language to learn the language. You also need to know the language and use the language of the content to be confident in what you know and to learn more about that content. It all works together. The first two fears that come to mind with this idea of the not so quiet classroom are losing control of the class, right? The management side of it, and that it takes time, and I already don't have enough time. Does that sound familiar, right? Silence feels like classroom management, right? It feels like I have control, everyone is in their place, everyone has something to do, and it's peace. Unfortunately, many of our students go entire days, if not longer, never speaking, which is not going to help them socially, psychologically, or academically. If we make our classroom content comprehensible with tons of strategies that we share throughout our courses at English Learner Portal, if you make it comprehensible, easier to understand for all students, they will want to talk about it. And let's face it, your students are going to talk. You can fight them on it, or you can embrace it and get them talking about what you want them to talk about in the way that you want them to talk about it. It's still a controlled situation. An ideal classroom for students would be 60% student talk and 40% teacher talk. So how do we get close to that, or closer and closer to that, without chaos taking over? And when do we do it? The exhaustion you feel every day would be better if students were doing 60% of the work. Think about it that way. I know conversation and discourse, discussion, all the things we call it, I know that it takes time. I also know that when you structure it well, that it saves time in the long run because you're not doing so much reteaching and repeating of information and directions. It helps them make sense of the content, to make connections, to lean on other experts so that they know more and you have to explain fewer times. Time saver right there. It also saves time by having students practice what they want to say, what they're thinking, to explain their thoughts, to gather the language, so that in the end, when you ask them to write about something, they've taken the time to do that, and you get a much better product in the end, which is also worth the time, because you're going to look at it and say, I know they know this. So let's take the time to give them that oral language development up front so that we see what we see in the classroom on their written responses in the end. Okay, so what do we do? All right, what are some quick things you can do to make this happen in your classroom? First thing is thinking about vocabulary. You want to make sure your students are using academic vocabulary and that the vocabulary you are already teaching is put into use in the lessons and in the student talk. So to do this, you want to provide them with the words in a visual manner. So whether it's an anchor chart or a board you put the words on, a word wall, that they see the written word and that there's some kind of image that they can attach to it to help them make the connection between the visual and the written word and the spoken word. Our English learners need multiple ways to approach this new vocabulary. If you have conversations about the vocabulary words, even better, because it will lead to more memory of those words and they will hear the words used in context. You could give them a personal vocabulary book where they're keeping track of it, where they're drawing their own images. So many options you already know, but maybe haven't thought about all the value that there are in pursuing those options. Again, it takes time, but it's time well spent. And it will give them confidence, right? So vocabulary routines for learning new words and making sure the students are using them regularly. Routines for everything are important. When you look at your management and you worry about chaos or conversation turning into off task, it's the routines you use that help hold the glue together of classroom management. You practice them. We introduce vocabulary the same way. You know what's going to happen. First, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then you're going to do this. It leads to much less confusion, much less discussion, much less negotiation, and you just dive right in. Those are the ways that you can control some of that off behavior in the process. You can find a handful of vocabulary routines, strategies, something you might want to adopt in our Content Teacher's Guide course, full of those kinds of ideas. Once they have the lingo down and they can talk the talk, right? They can use the words, then use things you're already using to raise your percentage of student talk time. I'm positive you already do something like a think, pair, share, or a turn and talk, right? They're usually 1-2 minute quick go, right? You're thinking about time. You want to give them a minute to process, or sometimes it's the turn and talk to your neighbor while I go grab that book I forgot to grab, or while I grab the worksheet, or while I write something on the board. That's all good. It's student talk time. But again, structure. When there is structure to that time, they can do amazing things that will lead them to better understanding of your content. So very simple addition to your turn and talk or think, pair, share. I always start my direction like this. When you turn to your partner, I should hear, and maybe I'm going to point to their anchor chart. I should hear this vocabulary. I should hear sentences like this. I should hear things like, I know this is the right solution because or let me tell you what I did first, right? You want to give them some language to use so they can participate in the conversation. And think about those new beginners. How can they participate? Give them something to contribute. My new beginners, I want you to point on the word wall to identify such and such. And then I want you to say and make it a simple sentence for them. Put the frame. They can follow it. Model, model, model. If you want their conversation to sound a certain way, then you really need to feed that to them and show them. Model it. Have a couple students model it. Refer them to the resources in the room that you've created with the words, with the sentences, so that they know what to talk about. So just that simple, you still have a couple minutes, but it has more structure and more direction to it. What you'll find is that you can let those conversations go a little longer without becoming a management issue because they have some structure to what they're supposed to be doing. From there, then you can build up and you can point out to them and say, that was an academic conversation. You sounded like scientists. That was how science sounds in the classroom. That is an academic conversation, not just chatting. Point that out to them so they know the difference. As your students get more comfortable with those expectations and they begin to understand that we're not chit-chatting, we're not socializing, that our conversations are academic focused in this classroom, then they will be able to take on more. When you feel like they're ready to take on a little longer stretch, we have tons of routines for academic discourse in our Content Teacher's Guide for English Learner Success course, and in other places in our membership and different places throughout English Learner Portal. We love discourse, so we share a lot of strategies around discourse. Strategy specific for reading a text or for talking about solving something in math, how to talk about a science process, all kinds of routines that you can use. So those baby steps, as you build up and develop routines and develop your management strategies around interaction, your students will take over more and more of the day with you being the guide instead of the person who's exhausted at the end of the day for running the show. Right? Baby steps of more and more guidance and independence will lead you to feeling less exhausted. You can make that classroom talk more productive with just a few supports in the room and then guide them to independence. So to sum it up, practice gives confidence. Routines give structure and purpose. Baby steps will take you closer and closer to students talking with confidence, cementing that content knowledge, and then being able to share it with you through their speaking and their writing, which would be worth the time invested. Give it a try.